the place I'm going to start today is I'm going to share with you a picture, if I can. It was a kind of Victorian picture, which some of you may have seen before, of the execution of Lady Grange. Yeah, so what I'd like you to do is to look at it, I suppose, from a kind of right brain point of view, of just sort of take it in. And you know, I'm not asking you to analyze it, but just consider it as a painting, and just look at all the components of that picture. Just take in everything that's happening across the board, and just notice anything that you feel about it, any kind of anything that's, you know, any kind of emotional response to it, any kind of intellectual response to it, anything that worries you about it. Just notice all of that. And yeah, I guess the next thing to think about is, you know, what is to start to introduce perhaps some kind of left brain thinking, and imagine what it is that a feminist might say about this picture. What kind of preconceptions have you got about what a feminist might say? And I'll just share with you why I've chosen to show you this picture. Is it reminded me of when my son started his GCSE course, and I went to a meeting, as you do. I got called to school for a meeting with all the other parents, and I was presented with his reading list. And I sort of scanned down the reading list, and I thought, oh, well, you know, there's no women writers there, which is something as a feminist I've learned to look for. You know, I know that quite often there's a real dominance of male writers. And the second thing I noticed was that the themes of all the texts seemed to be quite similar from a woman's point of view. So the first text on the list was Macbeth, and of course in the story of Macbeth, you've got Lady Macbeth, who ends up killing herself or committing suicide. She can't wash her blood-stained hands. She imagines that she's got blood on her hands and she has to wash them, and it ends up in her death. The second book on the list was The Inspector Calls, which was a play about the Victorian era that you might be familiar with, which again ends with a woman killing herself. And then the third text was Great Expectations, where one of the main characters is Miss Havisham, who is a jilted bride who lives in a great big house, which is a shrine to her wedding day that never happened, that's decaying, as if she is entombed in a house because she was never able to marry. And there is a suggestion in the book that perhaps she set it alight and burnt herself to death at the end of it. So in all those texts, there was this kind of, you know, the women came to a very nasty end. And on seeing this picture the other day, it was actually on a Twitter feed that I saw it. and it was being discussed by, it was art activist Barbie, so, which I'll try and share with you later. Again, I had a picture of art activist Barbie lined up to show you, but it's disappeared, and I don't know whether I'll bother getting it back again. But art activist Barbie had something to say about this picture, and you know, I'm not going to say what it was now, because I want you to stay open to the possibilities of this picture for a few more minutes. Okay, so I'm just going to stop sharing that there for a minute. So would anyone like to give an initial response to what they thought about that? Hi, Tony.
Yeah, it appears that he's sort of telling her intently, it's for your own good. It's just the way it is. The way that he's holding her, and he's saying, you know, this is the way it is. It's for your own good. It has to happen. The other two ladies in the background, one is wailing, and the other one's got her back turned as in despair. She can't do anything about it. And the two men are confident about the process, if you like. I don't know. It's just an idea.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a kind of, yeah, it's a bit, there's a kind of, it's a bit odd, isn't it? That someone, yeah. What about, has anyone else got any ideas about the subject of the painting? Do you feel it's an appropriate subject for the painting?
Okay, so you can talk if you want. Subject.
It looks like a painting meant to inform the masses to behave themselves. If you don't, this is what can happen to you. I mean, that's the purpose of making those giant paintings, right?
Yeah, yeah, possibly. So it's a kind of warning to others. Yeah. Yeah, that, so is anyone familiar with the story of Lady Jane Grey and her background?
I've heard her name, but I don't know the incidents.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I mean, it could easily have been said Queen Jane, because she was queen for 9 days between a king and another queen. So she was kind of placed there by, she was only 17 years old. She was placed on the throne after the death of a king as a kind of puppet, really. And then when the supporters of the next queen, which was Mary I, came along, they decided she had to be executed, and she was beheaded. So that's the story behind it. So does anyone else got a response in terms of the subject matter of the painting?
Yeah, it looked very much like, she looked almost like an innocent bride. She was powerless, blindfold, just a victim of circumstance with absolutely no control over what was happening. Yeah. 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 Thanks ever so much for that, Brendan. Has anyone got anything in response?
Yeah, I was struck by the only people who can look are the men, because she's not allowed to look because she's blindfolded, and the woman on the left of the picture, as we look at it, is looking away, like as if she either, you know, can't bear to look, or I'm presuming that might be what the situation is. But it's interesting that the women are not looking at what's happening, and the men, both their gaze is directed at her and what's happening.
That's very interesting, isn't it? And one of them, of course, is holding a big axe, isn't he? Yeah. So
the axeman has a look of complete indifference about this. Is like completely no emotional involvement. It's a real contrast to the woman swooning. It's like, you know.
Normal procedure.
Okay.
Yes.
So what you're noticing is that there's a kind of real contrast between the men and the women in the picture. So there is that kind of I think what Lenny was saying there was that they're looking directly at her. They seem to be in control of the situation. There's an emotionlessness about the men, contrasting with the weeping of the women. And of course, in the way that they're dressed, there's a particular kind of construct, a particular kind of contrast. And I think the word bride was mentioned, wasn't it? That she seems to be dressed in white satin. So I don't want to draw any conclusions, but I just want to leave it open for now. I think we've got a couple more people joining us now. But yes, and we'll come back to it at the end and see where we are. So I'm going to come back now to feminism and the middle way. So when I first came across middle way philosophy, I was struck immediately that with its similarity with the feminist writers that I knew. So going back to Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex, her thesis was really that you're not born a woman, that you become a woman, that it's through a kind of process of embodiment within a society, you become what's reflected back at you, what's expected of you. And I know that what inspired the writing of it for her was that there was a kind of disconnect between what she saw herself as and what was being reflected back at her. So she saw herself as a clever, intellectual, able, powerful person. And in contrast, what was reflected back at her was somewhat different to that sometimes. That there were different expectations on her as a woman, and obviously in the title of the book, in The Second Sex, she very much gives you the sense that at the center of everything is the male. And that anything that doesn't measure up to that falls outside it somehow. So she's very much into the idea of being embodied, of becoming, of being a part of the society that you're in, and how that changes you and how that affects you. And that's really continues through a lot of that thread continues through a lot of feminist writing, that there's both that kind of the centrality of man to our culture and how woman somehow falls outside that. And a lot of writers have added to that and said, well, actually, white man is in the center of the culture, and everyone that isn't a white man somehow falls outside that. And then I think the post-structuralists noticed, well, actually, men never really fill the position of white man either. So nobody's really holding that ideal center of society. It's a kind of symbol. It's a kind of ideal that actually we all fall outside of. We're all fall short of. We never embody it really, that kind of ideal. So in terms of feminist writers, you may have come across Judith Butler, who is a more modern writer, but she very much picks up from where she holds, she says there's a continuity between her and Simone de Beauvoir, that she very much sees people are, she uses a sense of identity where we're called into place, that using the word woman or the word man calls you into place. And also, as a part of that, what she notices, and what many people have identified as something that they can see in their own behavior, she sees gender as a performance. And at one point in her book Gender Trouble, she says all gender is drag. So there's a sense that we can all pretend to be, we can all act being a different gender. We know the characteristics of gender, and we can perform those, whatever that might be. And so it's not a part of our biology. It's a part of our psychology and who we are, how we are called into being within our families and our social situation, which would be diverse across the world. It's obviously, you know, the experience of what a woman is or what a man is very different depending on what culture you're in. The kind of performance that's expected of you will be very much about being embodied in that situation. So it's, you know, I hope that you can see the kind of connection that has with middle way philosophy. What's interesting, of course, is with feminism, there is a sense that you're being quite extreme in what you say. So Judith Butler's work, for instance, is seen as quite an extreme view, that that gender is a performance. Well, no, surely no, it must be rooted in biology in some way. Now, she's not denying that there is biology, and that's part of how we're socialized. But what she's saying is that these kind of these techniques of the body that we have are something that are cultural, not biological. And then if we go off slightly in terms of the middle way again, this this idea of where people are in society, the terms intersectionality has become very popular in recent years. It was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, where she tried to articulate what feminists had said for many years, over many years, which was, we all show up as different things at different times. So I may be a school teacher, I may be a mother, I may be a doctor, I may be a sister, a daughter, and all those things give me a different role in society, and will have different expectations and duties attached to them. But also what Kimberly Crenshaw noticed, or rather what she was trying to describe, was how people are discriminated against in different ways when they're in the same body. So if you're a disabled person, you may be discriminated against on grounds of disability, but if you're a woman, you may be doubly discriminated against because you're a woman and because of you're disabled. And then if you're a Black disabled woman, similarly on those. And so she introduced this idea of intersectionality as if roads are crossing, an intersection of roads. And it was a kind of imaginative metaphor for describing how we can think about the fact that we're not just one thing, and that we can be disadvantaged in society in many ways, or advantaged in society in many different ways. So in terms of what Ian McGilchrist says, that kind of metaphorical way of looking at the world is very much of the right brain. And I think what we can see sometimes in these kind of metaphors that feminists have found useful is that they can become very concrete when they sort of go out into the world. So along with intersectionality, there was another essay written by Peggy McIntosh, which was about privilege. It was called White Privilege, and Unpacking the Invisible. And again, it was a fantastic metaphor for the things that the disadvantages that we're born with, and what's weighing us down, and what stops us perhaps being able to walk through the same doors as someone from a different background, whether that's our race, our gender, our sexuality, our disability. That some of us have privileges. And again, she's using this metaphor in terms of carrying a knapsack. But when that sort of metaphorical, imaginative use of language becomes part of activism, it can become really concrete. So people start, using an American term, calling people out on their privilege for not being aware of their privilege, for not checking their privilege, which of course pushes people further apart. I mean, however true what someone might be pointing out is, it actually, the reaction in the other person is to become very defensive. So, but in their writing, they're using metaphors to try and imagine how things might be different. We've got, there's another couple of things that I wanted to mention. The French feminists in particular were inspired by psychoanalysis and the work of Jacques Lacan, who they very much criticize him. They see his work as reinforcing on many occasions kind of gender stereotypes, but they're quite inspired by what he says, because it gives what he says is that the Oedipus complex is language itself. So the Oedipus complex is at the point at which we acquire language and culture. So that is the law of the father becoming, being enforced in us, in a sense, splitting us perhaps between our left and right brain. That it pins down language, it pins down what we are, it defines us, but we are in excess of all of that. And what the French feminists saw in that was the possibility that we could imagine something else, that we don't necessarily have to be pinned down by this language that is in a sense being forced on us, that we can imagine and we can modify and we can negotiate that language. And from Black American feminism, Bell Hooks coined this term yearning, which I really like, where she feels that yearning is a shared space of feelings, that it's common to all human beings, that we're reaching towards something, we have common passions and sentiments, and that this is shared by everyone, that we're all, we all have wishes for ourselves, our families and others, and and of course we can see that very much as in the kind of imaginative, metaphorical, unformed landscape of the right brain. So yeah, I hope that's just a little tour through how I see feminism fitting within middle way philosophy, or actually contributing a great deal towards middle way philosophy. I'm going to, in contrast to the picture I showed you earlier, I'm going to share with you a slightly different picture now, if I can. Hope it doesn't go wrong again. This is a picture which was originally on the cover of a book by Donna Haraway, and the book contained the Cyborg Manifesto. And in that essay, she imagines us women and people that perhaps aren't in the center of power, in the power centers, being able to reimagine a future where we're perhaps not, we can sidestep Freud, we can sidestep the idea of being oppressed by our language and culture, and actually imagine something entirely different. So, and what she imagines is a cyborg. And throughout her work, what she tries to do is she tries to say, actually, you know, we're all cyborgs. These kind of divisions or contrasts between human and machine and human and animal, they don't really exist. They're created. They're conceptual. That every day we use computers. When we're online, people, you know, they don't recognize us in our gendered bodies. We're a kind of disembodied voice in many ways. We're part machine, part human. And of course, and her work also extends very much to animals, which I think this picture represents, where she sees that kind of again a division, the false divisions we make between animals and ourselves, cause particular power relationships. So I guess this, in Robert's sense of the word, is very much an archetype, perhaps in the same way as the previous picture of Lady Jane Grey was an archetype as well, of a quite different kind. But this is a different kind of imagining. Okay. So with those two images in your brain, really I'd like to go forward in talking about how things are today in the world, that there very much seems to be a backlash against feminism, and clearly that perhaps started most obviously for me with the election of Donald Trump, where a man that appeared to be clearly misogynistic was elected. People didn't appear to mind the sexism, and how that kind of right wing, it's not only right wing, it's very, it seems to suggest a particular kind of traditional role for women, has spread certainly to Brazil, often a racist agenda there as well, and homophobic message. So it's, there's a kind of support by the Catholic Church as well of this. So it's very, it seems, and I know that Donald Trump, although he doesn't seem to be overtly Christian, he seems to attract Christianity, that kind of traditional Christianity, Christian view of women quite a lot. That kind of right-wing Catholicism has also become a feature in Poland and Hungary, and has also the kind of populism in general spreading across Europe. You may remember in the UK election that at one point sorry, someone's just walked in. in spite of my very clear instructions not to. So you may remember, Boris Johnson was implored in Parliament not to use such divisive language, because it had meant that they were drawing a clear parallel between that kind of divisive language and the death of Jo Cox. And he just stood up and said, I think the word was poppycock. So he kind of rejected that as a possibility, really. There's also women MPs in the UK receive death threats every day, especially Black MPs and Jewish MPs, both from right wing and the left wing. And feminist philosophers have also found themselves at the in the firing line, really. In November 2017, Judith Butler attended a conference in Brazil where demonstrators outside burnt an effigy of her while chanting "Go to hell" and "witch." So they perceived her as what they saw as gender ideology. So it's a kind of anti-trans view, very much supported by Catholicism, where, you know, God gave you a body, you should be happy with that body, and gender ideology is against God, against children, against the family, and a threat to the natural order. So yeah, so something I guess I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, that a feminist, a little known feminist philosopher 10 years ago has now become the object of such hatred. Then in September 2018, Jordan Peterson threatened to sue feminist philosopher Kate Mann after she criticised his book. Now, Peterson, rather famously, anti-women's studies, anti-social science in general, has described women's studies types as counter-civilized political activists, which he deems dangerous to society. And dismisses all social sciences as not science, as women's studies is pretty much groundless, that they shouldn't be funded, that you shouldn't send your children to college to be exposed to this kind of stuff. So after saying all of that, Kate Mann suggested that aspects of his book, 12 Rules for Life, could be considered misogynistic. And in spite of his renowned support for free speech, he thought that this was a good opportunity to sue her and to silence her, which, in a question in my mind, is how he could justify that to himself. I'm really not sure. So yeah, I guess what I want to do now is to open it up to you, really, and your awareness of the backlash against feminism from the right, not only obviously within that, it's not only feminism that there's a backlash against. There's an evidence of racism. There's an anti-trans agenda as well, and I think what's really important is just, I guess, going back to intersectionality, it's very, very important that people that are marginalized in that way work together rather than being split into small groups in what people call identity politics, ever decreasing small groups, but actually that the problems we face are very, very similar. So yeah, I just want, if anyone got anything to contribute about, or their experience of the backlash, or anything they've noticed in society, or anything they've experienced themselves or in the media that they'd like to share. Just unmute yourself and contribute if you'd like to.
Oh, hi, Nina.
Hiya.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, a few things have come to mind. I mean, one of the things in relation to feminism and the middle way, and the middle way sort of attempt to avoid absolutes, it seems to me that that's a lot about the backlash that's currently going on, but also you know, before that, sort of attitudes to feminism are often, seems to me, to be based on absolutes. People are, you know, perhaps assuming absolutes about who feminists are and what they believe. For example, you know, when I was first a feminist many years ago, if you ventured to say that you're a feminist, by and large people assumed that that meant you hated men, which wasn't the case at all, and isn't anything to do with feminism as I understand it. And I feel that a lot of the probably backlash against it now is perhaps more to do with people's assumptions and false absolutized beliefs about what feminism is, than actually anything to do with the reality. Because in my experience of dipping into feminism, there's such a vast range of beliefs and approaches to things, probably, you know, as many as there are individual women. So to sort of be catalogued and categorized in that way, and that perhaps ties in a bit with what Ian McGilchrist was saying, because perhaps that's left brain, you know, attempt to try and contain and categorize everything, that sort of feminism is kind of falling foul of. And obviously there are people sort of trying to work against that. I mean, for instance, I came across a couple of really interesting things, videos recently. One was Scarlett Curtis, and finding out about her sort of the Pink Project, as she calls it, and she's written an anthology that's called Feminists Don't Wear Pink, because she makes a point of the fact she loves pink, and she kind of felt, and she likes wearing makeup, and so she'd felt intimidated by some sort of more traditional, perhaps, feminists who might be, you know, opposing the labeling of girls as wearing pink or wanting to wear makeup. And then also another one, Jamila Jamil, who's had another campaign called I Weigh, which is very much sort of trying to make the point that women are more than what they weigh. So they use like the hashtag I Weigh and say lots of things about all the brilliant things that they're doing, or qualities they have, or talents they have, you know, as opposed to saying I weigh X pounds, which, you know, makes me more or less fit within the cultural ideal of, you know, what's quote normal.
Yeah, it's I think what I've noticed very much, Lenny, is that it's very difficult for women to be visible because of the kind of attitudes towards them. And I mentioned the art activist Barbie on Twitter she's gathered quite a following. Now, the idea behind this is that feminist critics take a Barbie doll into an art gallery and just put a little message on the Barbie next to the picture, so that people can read what it says. So the feminist view. So it might be something simple. So in the National Gallery, I think the Barbie says something like, well, there's 221 male artists here and 20 women. Yeah. So that's a very simple contrast. Now, and that's okay if it comes from Barbie. Yeah, a Barbie doll. It's okay. People can think it's you know, she's not very threatening. She's a kind of bizarre version of a woman, but she's a friendly version of a woman that people recognize. So it's, you know, it's, I think it's a kind of brilliant critique of the fact that it's when a woman says that, look, this gallery is full of art by women and men, and there's only one by a woman, isn't that, you know, you at that point you become, you're not making a fair point, you're being a miserable Marxist feminist, which I've been called many times. So yeah, so it's very difficult. So it's very difficult to find ways of being visible as a woman. And I think the two things you've talked about there are, and as a feminist actually as well. How do you be a feminist? How do you be a woman? It's a very unstable category. Yeah. Has anybody else got any responses?
I just wonder sometimes, and as a middle way problem, is the polarization and the extreme to the other side, where, as my son likes to call, the feminazis are there. So somebody uses the wrong pronoun or assumes gender, and suddenly this can be a person that is not espousing anything particularly misogynistic or hate speech, but is being run down because they're not completely on their side, and it is that whole polarization. Trump being the classic example on the one side, but Trump sometimes, you know, even a broken clock can be right occasionally. Sometimes he says something right, but if you were to point that out, no, yeah, because anything associated with him is evil. Yeah, Jordan Peterson, I find a very interesting topic, because some of the things he says are very interesting and deliberately controversial. And it's very difficult sometimes to find anybody that will engage him in a nuanced way. And again, I've read the 12 Rules for Life. It's interesting, but it's confusing. There's some good stuff in there and some very confusing stuff as well. But it's trying to find a nuanced debate rather than deplatforming people. And the same in race. You know, you see that, you know, I think when Benedict Cumberbatch used the wrong word for referring to a person of color, it was, you know, wait a minute, why are we picking on him? He's clearly not a racist person. He spoke, yeah. And I think the middle way, trying to bring more nuance and open discussion on these issues. And I think, sorry, I'm saying a lot here, but I've listened to some interesting things about understanding what white identity is. I don't think, because it is so much being perceived as the norm, people like me don't recognize that we have an identity and a way of relating and a way of communicating, and we actually need to be educated in that. So sorry, that's a whole mess of different topics, so I'll leave it to you.
No, and what you're pointing to in your last comment there is that there is a lot of left brain stuff around this is how things are. I guess that people want to pin things down, but actually society is really, really chaotic. And there's a brilliant YouTuber who I love called Natalie Wynn, or ContraPoints. And she started off her YouTube channel some years ago, kind of challenging alt-right young men. And she's a trans woman, and through the period of time she's made those videos, she's transitioned. So they're very, very different. They started off as kind of political, you know, trying to educate people about political history, and have moved kind of through to identity, really, watching her identity change through that time. And but she's incredibly sharp, and she's and very, very witty, and is very, very nuanced in what she says. And in fact, she got deplatformed by her trans community just before Christmas because she said the wrong thing. And then she made a rather brilliant video about being deplatformed, which was very emotional, went on for an hour and a half, but it was brilliant because she's a very, very good kind of YouTube essayist. So I would really recommend looking her up. Yeah, just for exactly that nuance, that ability to forgive, that ability to try and empathize with someone else, and not to alienate them, but to include them. Whatever, you know, whatever it is, however bad what they've said, how offensive what they've said might be, it isn't them as a person that they, you know, the change is possible. Yeah. Okay. Has anyone else got?
That's exactly where I was at, and I think sometimes, as I say in the debate, it's looking a little bit more at yourself and going, not so much, hey, these and these, and actually looking at yourself and going, what am I like? How am I adding to this or not adding to this debate?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I was just going to say, or, you know, looking inside and asking the question, what about this is so important to me? And then maybe arriving at some insights about, you know, how we engage with the world with our judgments and our defenses and our need to create some sense of safety for ourselves.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Speaking as a very old school, first flush 1970s raving feminist, who's lived a lot of years as a feminist. For me, looking at the whole history of the movement, I think it's valuable to ask, what is the point of feminism? What is the value of feminism? You know, unfortunately, the middle way, for my money, could inadvertently become a neutrality, which empowers, you know, perpetrators, which sort of arms the oppressor, if you want slightly less emotive language. What I thought was most valuable in relation to feminism was the work in terms of forgiveness, really. Although I'm totally against forgiveness, but I'm totally for empathy and compassion. And I think empathy and compassion are immensely useful positions in understanding rather than explaining away. Because if you just want to silence us, you know, by saying, well, you can't have an extreme position, you know, you've got to have a middle way, that could be dangerous neutrality. For example, if only the situation, I don't know if you've ever seen the work on the incels. I mean, it's almost, I lasted literally 5 minutes. I thought, well, yes, there's a program on documentary on them. I literally could only stomach just a few minutes. I had to turn it off, you know. And you've got to have a major position on such extremes group. And an old friend of mine, who a guy, was explaining how many extreme, aggressive, anti-women groups there are around the world, because unfortunately the web is an ideal platform for those people like incels and many, many other groups like that to meet and act and organize. But for me, a starting point for me is the middle way. Using compassion and empathy recognizes how indescribably damaged men are by their upbringing in of dominant values, which is misogynist. Because looking at the value of feminism, it's of life issues it's survival issues for women, but recognizing the danger of that, the degree of misogyny that arrives at an incel, but also the life-threatening situation of domestic violence, which has been hidden for centuries. You know, the economic disadvantage of having to have a baby and bring up a child, you know, the responsibilities in the domestic environment, which is sort of taken on as well as a full-time job. You know, there are innumerable things about feminism, which if you just see it as a conflict ideology, I think that really undermines, you know, the political value of supporting change for women. Sorry, that's all I wanted to say.
No, thank you for that. And I think that very much echoes my feeling that that where you know, the middle way isn't about being a little diluted. It's about it's absolutely and you know, about perhaps I think challenging some of the kind of concrete assumptions actually about what a feminist is, concrete language that can, you know, actually alienate people. You know, not that it represents anything bad, but it can be alienating. I mean, I know a number of men that have been quite alienated by the term "all men are rapists," for example. Now, within context, that can be explained, but it's not terribly helpful. And whereas the kind of idea of yearning and imagining a more equal society and how we can move towards that, in a kind of you know, exploring that kind of unformed world, the cyborg, not the execution. You know, that kind of is perhaps more helpful. Yeah, thank you very much for that, Susan. Hello, Barry.
Yeah, could I just say that for me, the middle way, if you avoid extremes, doesn't put you into a position of neutrality. Arguably, the middle way is the position which most adequately addresses conditions. So, for example, I mean, last October I got arrested in London with XR. You know, that some people might see that as an extreme position, but to me, the extreme position is the one of the government who are not addressing the condition of climate change. And to me, my position was trying to enable to highlight the fact that we need to address these conditions. So that you know, the middle way is not this wishy-washy compromise that, you know, is often assumed to be the case. Just because you avoid extremes doesn't mean you can't be decisive.
No, I fully understand that. But in fact, I wouldn't want it to be that, and it isn't that. But some people in defining feminism as an extremist position devalues feminism, and you know, and really, there's also a lot of fear in the prejudice amongst women themselves, partly because of the cult of celebrity. But if you've got to, you know, if your sort of win-win point is to be like a Kardashian, you know, apart from the amount of plastic surgery and money you're going to have to pay to your plastic surgeon, you know, I thought it was so sad when Dolly Parton said she'd worn out her plastic surgeon over the years. You know, those are sort of hidden things that are totally shocking, and where women, you know, identify with a Kardashian far more than they would with a feminist who's defined as a, you know, raving aggressive loony. Yeah. And this is what I meant about, you know, we have to be careful of the language that we actually use and the implications of labeling people very simplistically. That's all I meant by referring to it in that way. Sorry.
Yeah, that's absolutely. Thank you, Susan. Thank you. Thank you. Can we, yeah, would anybody like, I just wanted to wind up really with any has anyone had any further thoughts about the picture I showed at the beginning of Lady Jane Grey's execution in terms of a feminist position, or whether they've, you know, it's sort of worked their way into their mind and their reaction to it over the last hour?
I was very impressed that I didn't rise to it. Would you like to guess what a feminist would say? Sort of, I planted my hand over my mouth, you know, and sort of rammed my jaw together.
Yeah.
For me, the immediate thing is completely normalizes violence against women. It's not worthy of comment. This, you know, a young slip of a thing in a silk white dress, perfectly normal. Perfectly normal to chop her off her head. Yes, not worthy of comment, really. Just, you know, worthy of art to hang on the wall. Sort of.
I would like to speak to that.
Oh, yeah, I'd like to say something if possible as well. After you. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I did have an impulse to say that this is very aberrant behavior against another human being. So we can just say, okay, any human being in this situation would be is going to die in this terrible, cruel way, and this seems to make it okay to do to women. It specifically, and the fact that women are killed at home by somebody that has professed to love them all the time is my point.
Thank you.
Sorry, but
No.
it's horrible. We have to live with it or get rid of it. So I'm angry. I'm done.
Okay.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yes. Hi. This is my first time I've been on a middle way thing festival with you, and good to see you, Nina. I mean, I don't call myself a feminist. Perhaps I'm in a group with at least for the last 6 months with at least 6 women. I'm the only man. Now there's, yeah. So I've experienced it being, you know, the man in a woman's world. And my mother's an alcoholic, and I've got issues with my mother still, you know, from the past, way back. So I think we're all damaged by violence. So what I wanted to say about that image of the, you know, of Lady Jane, it's terrible. Violence to anybody is terrible. It's terrible. I mean, I could find probably thousands of violent death to men as well. So I'm not saying that you haven't got a point, but at all. I'm for whatever feminism is doing, and I guess that's what you're doing. You're speaking up for women, which is great. But I mean, really, the issue is violence to anybody.
It is. I think it is that kind of, what it is in this case, Dharmabandhu, is it's looking at how women are represented. So
Right.
it's so absolutely. So men are represented in a violent way too, but possibly in quite a different way. So if you know, in terms of the archetype, it might be a kind of warrior, or it might be and of course Susan mentioned before that men are just as much victims, well, are victims of misogyny too. It's the kind of, you know, you will behave this way in order to be a real man. That is misogyny, you know, that kind of insisting that men behave or perform gender in a particular way is misogyny. So but in terms of women's representation, what that picture is an extreme example of is how women are represented as virginal, bridal, pure, and also, you know, just the most unbelievably violent image to be put on the wall of a art gallery. And yeah, I'm not saying it shouldn't be, and I'm not, you know, it's a kind of, it's what we live with, isn't it? And it asks questions about who we are and what we think is acceptable. And you know, and that's why I later showed the picture of the cyborg, because that presents perhaps a different image. Yeah, one that hasn't, you know, had hundreds of years of history attached to it. Something that we might imagine that's a bit new. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dharmabandhu. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. Who's that?
Marcus, yes. One of the things that occurs to me in looking at that picture that would perhaps discriminate it from a man inhabiting the role of the woman in that painting is the this sort of expression of, I guess you could call it the patriarchy, but the treatment of this of the woman is so different than it would be if it was a male that was being executed. You know, I think the male would be afforded the dignity of some equality with the executioner with respect to how they're being treated. In this picture, this woman is treated as you might treat a young child with no power and no agency in the situation. So I'm sure that there's been more violence done to males by other males. You know, there's no shortage of that, and yet the relationship of the, you know, how those people are like placed in the power structure is so different.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
I think the word sacrifice comes to mind. She's being sacrificed. She's like a lamb. I mean,
yeah, and of course is that in that kind of very strange virginal outfit as well.
Yeah.
Which, you know, you have those kind of those archetypes for women, which are very difficult. You have the mother, the virgin, and the prostitute, and they're all within kind of and the witch. Yeah.
I thought it made a nice change from the nudes.
Well, there is that.
It's a ported pose.
In that art gallery.
Well, the nudes are just on the opposite wall, aren't they? And then there's Ophelia around the corner. Oh dear.
So basically, if you're a woman in a portrait, you can be nude or you can be dead or about to.
Yes. Yeah. I'm afraid we've run out of time, everyone. I'm very sorry about the beginning where I had that all kerfuffle with the pictures. But I hope we have actually, we're about 10 minutes over, so I hope we've made that up. Thank you so much for your contributions. It's been lovely to talk with you and to see you all, and take good care. And I hope to see you again one day soon. Bye.